Did you just hear those ads? Do you not want to? Because Crimelines is available ad-free on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple subscriptions. You will also get access to my other twice-monthly podcast, Beyond the Files. That's where I take cases that were covered on Forensic Files and tell you the rest of the story. Links to those platforms are in the show notes. Hey everyone, I wanted to update that the trip to Chile and Argentina is half full. We have sold out all of the early bird spots, and there are, as I am recording this, 10 total spots available. I know we have a few people who are still deciding if they're going to book or not, so that number very well may change by the time I get this episode out there. This is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to explore 3 cities in 2 countries with 3 different podcasters, and we are doing a live show as we are literally crossing the Andes. The link to information is in the show notes. The company we are traveling with has a number of payment options, including financing, so you can check out all of the details at the link, and I hope to see you there. When I cover cases, I try to give you the who, what, where, when, and why. But in the disappearance of Faith Lindsey, which is a solved case, I still can't give you the answer to the most pressing question for the family. And that is, where is Faith? I don't have that answer, but I'm confident someone does. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome. Today's case was suggested to me a couple of years ago when I mentioned the Supreme Court ruling regarding land in Oklahoma still belonging to the tribes. I said I wanted to do a case that looked at the impact of this ruling, but most of the cases were pending trial at the time, and I don't tend to cover cases until they have been resolved. I mean, if there's been an arrest, obviously I cover truly unsolved cases, but if there has been an arrest, if this is going to trial, I have nothing left to offer until it's over. So the ruling we're talking about, McGirt v. Oklahoma, was in mid-2020, and this case, which happened in 2019 and was still pending at that point, seemed like a good one to look at. And it also looked like in 2022 that it was going to be resolved, so I started working on the research in this case in late 2022, but it only just got resolved a couple of months ago. The ruling in McGirt and the law around it evolved even in the time we were waiting on this resolution, so I also have updates on what happened in the fallout of this ruling. But before we get to that, we have to cover the disappearance and presumed murder of Faith Lindsey. Faith grew up in Oklahoma, and she was an enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation. In their own language, the tribe's name is Chikashsha, and based on oral histories, the Chickasaw broke off from a group that included the Choctaw back in the 17th century. The exact etymology of the word Chickasaw seems to have some debate, with some saying it came from the Spanish, who had contact with the Chickasaw as early as 1540, and they recorded the name as Chickasaw, and this eventually evolved into Chickasaw. But it has been noted that a leader of the Chickasaw, which is called a Minko or a Mingo in their language, was named Chickasaw, and that may be how the entire tribe got its English name. The Chickasaw's traditional lands include areas of present-day Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee. When the Spanish made contact, though, they were primarily in what is present-day Mississippi, near where the city of Tupelo is. Like with a lot of tribes, the Chickasaw traded with Europeans, fought in wars in the Americas, including the Revolutionary War, and they entered into peace treaties with the newly formed United States. But then in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed, which gave the government the power to force native tribes from east of the Mississippi River to land west of the river. A couple of years after this, the state of Mississippi outlawed tribal sovereignty, which immediately gave them governing power over the Chickasaw. In 1837, the Chickasaw signed the Treaty of Dokesville, in which they agreed to move west, in large part because they wanted to regain sovereignty and the right to self-govern. But unlike many tribes who were given land grants, which was basically the government taking their land in exchange for a plot of random land out in present-day Oklahoma, the Chickasaw wanted something else. They held out for actual payment for their lands. They ended up negotiating a $3 million payout for land east of the river, and then they purchased land in Indian Territory from the Choctaw who had already relocated. They ended up paying about $500,000 for the land in Indian Territory, so this would have been one of the better deals that any tribe got, except that it took 30 years for the government to pay out the money. But believing the money was coming, on July 4th, 1837, the Chickasaw joined the Trail of Tears in Memphis. By the time they reached what is present-day Oklahoma, more than 500 people had died, mostly of disease. Because the Chickasaw were taking over Choctaw land that they had purchased, the government eventually merged the two tribes in part to make their own paperwork easier. But it was only an administrative merging. The two maintained their own traditions, and eventually they would both become federally recognized nations separate from each other. So that is the overview story of how the Chickasaw ended up in Oklahoma, and that's why Faith Lindsey grew up there alongside her sister Justice. Faith was from Ada, where she was an excellent student, and at 17, in June of 2019, she moved from Ada to Pauls Valley to live with her boyfriend, Tanner Washington. Faith was 17, but Tanner was 24. Faith's sister and other family members did not approve of the relationship, initially due to the age difference. But Faith just couldn't see their issues with it. Her sister told KFOR News that Tanner showed Faith a lot of attention, and he wanted to buy her nice things, and she really hadn't experienced that in her life thus far. This love bombing he did was new to her, and it made her feel really special. And so when they got into an argument and Tanner turned physical for the first time, Faith was willing to forgive him. Things were smooth for a while before it happened again. And afterwards, Tanner was sorry and he treated Faith like a queen to make up for it. And then, of course, it happened again. There was what we know is a predictable pattern, but at 17, Faith didn't see it that way. Though Faith may have been going through this for the first time, Tanner certainly was not. According to the Oklahoma court lookup, a restraining order was placed against him in 2012 when he was just 18 years old. The accusations in it were for stalking and harassment. In June of 2019, so around the time Faith moved in, Tanner was arrested for domestic violence, which he pleaded no contest to in mid-September. Though some reports do not mention who the victim was, there are some people who say that the victim was Faith. After pleading no contest, Tanner was given a 2-year deferred sentence, and that meant if he made it through his probation period without another arrest and he followed all of the terms, which included taking anger management classes, he would not spend any time behind bars. He took that deal and he and Faith continued to live together in Pauls Valley until late October. With what comes next, the names of the people I'm talking about are protected in the documents I have, so I'm going to just go ahead and use pseudonyms. On October 29th, 2019, a woman we will call Samantha called the police. She said she lived in Stratford, Oklahoma, which is near Pauls Valley, and a young man named Tanner Washington had come by the night before. He was friends with her niece, who he used to date, we will call her Kim, and he wanted to speak with Samantha's husband, who was a minister. Tanner ended up meeting with the minister uncle and 2 other people at the church in Stratford, and he told them that his girlfriend, Faith, had been shot in Chickasaw, which is a small town about an hour northeast of Pauls Valley. Tanner said it was his fault she had been shot, and he was really upset about it. Samantha, at first, on hearing this, didn't really know how to take it. She and her husband both knew that Tanner had a history of drug use, and they weren't really sure if anyone had actually been hurt or if Tanner was delusional. The way he was acting when he showed up made them think he may not be fully aware of what did or did not happen. But then they slept on it and decided to go ahead and call the police. The officer who took this report first tried to call Faith to check in on her, so he looked up her phone number and dialed it. A man answered the phone and said, "Faith, is that you?" It turned out that the number they had listed for Faith was actually Tanner's cell phone. The officer said he was calling to check on Faith, and Tanner said he didn't know where she was. And this phone call is where we get story number 1 from Tanner, Washington. Tanner said he took Faith to her shift at the local Sonic fast food restaurant on Sunday, October 27th. Her shift started at 3 p.m., so he estimated he would have dropped her off around 2:50 in the afternoon. After about 2 hours, he said he went back to the Sonic to bring her a drink. He went to bring her a drink at Sonic. For those of you who do not live near a Sonic, you may not be aware of the drink options at Sonic. According to their website, and yes, I looked it up, of course I did, there are 168,894 possible combinations of their drink bases and added flavors. But Tanner thought that Faith would need a drink while at work. Anyway, he said when he got there, he was surprised to find that she wasn't there. He asked her coworkers where she was, and they said they hadn't seen her. Between 2:50 when he dropped her off and 3 p.m. when her shift started, she seemingly vanished. Tanner said he wasn't immediately alarmed for whatever reason, and he spent the next 2 days looking for her, even driving out to Ada, thinking maybe she had gone back to her family. He said he got a call from her once in the middle of the night, but he was sleeping, so he didn't answer. But in the morning, when he woke up, he tried to call her back, and she didn't pick up. Tanner did not offer the information that she had been shot, so the officer asked about it and asked Tanner if he had told anyone that Faith had been shot. And Tanner said yes, but he said it was not because he witnessed it, but because someone had sent him a message telling him that Faith had been shot. The officer asked Tanner to come down to the station so they could get a full statement. Around 3:30 on that same day, so October 29th, Tanner showed up at the station as promised, and they took him into an office to talk to him. They asked him the basics about Faith, as well as her family and her friends who might know where she was. Tanner said Faith didn't have a lot of friends she was in contact with. She had moved to Paul's Valley to live with him in June of that year in order to get away from the people in Ada, including her family. And he said she was pretty much just in touch with her sister Justice and a couple of friends. Tanner was then asked if Faith had substance abuse issues, and he reportedly started to cry, saying that he didn't want the police to think she was a junkie. The officers had experience with families wanting to not disclose that type of information because they worry that if their loved one isn't the perfect victim, the police won't look for them. They assured Tanner that they just needed that information so they knew where to look for her. At this point, Tanner said that Faith's father had ties to a gang, the Indian Brotherhood, and that Faith had had issues with them in the past. He said that one time she and her sister Justice were kidnapped until their father did some type of task he was ordered to do, but Tanner didn't know what the job was. He said there was another time that Faith disappeared, and when she got back, he confronted her on her whereabouts, and she told him that the Indian Brotherhood had taken her to a house in Ada and forced her to stab someone. So when he couldn't find Faith, he was worried maybe something similar had happened. Tanner then told the officer about a call he got after Faith went missing. He said it was a woman on the other end, and she said, "She is gone and she isn't coming back," and then hung up. Now, with this information that they were given, the investigators started looking into what Tanner said in the hopes it would lead them to Faith. They took the accusation of possible gang involvement to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations, as well as the DA's Drug and Violent Crime Task Force, to get some assistance. For the record, I've seen no confirmation of any of the stories Tanner told to the police about the Indian Brotherhood. Faith's involvement with them, Faith's father's involvement with them, or even Faith using any sort of illicit substance. But of course, that was not the focus of the investigation anyway, because they were focusing on finding Faith, and they did a trace on Faith's cell phone. The GPS for Faith's phone showed a location about an hour east of Pauls Valley in an area that had a lot of nothing. But there are some houses, including a subdivision, so they did a knock and talk around the neighborhood, but no one reported having seen Faith out there. The investigator on the case then called the Sonic where Faith worked and asked the manager on duty, Sabrina, about Faith. Sabrina said she hadn't heard from Faith in a couple of days, and she never made it to work on the day Tanner said he dropped her off. She knew Tanner and Faith had issues, including violence within the relationship, and she believed that Tanner was on probation for a battery on Faith. She also said Tanner would show up while Faith was working and bother her, and it seems like maybe Faith could usually get him to leave, but at least one time Sabrina had to intervene when he wasn't just bothering Faith, but also her coworkers. When the investigators couldn't find anyone, including family, who had seen Faith in the last few days, he decided it was time to talk to Tanner again. He asked Tanner about the phone call from the mysterious woman, the one that said Faith wasn't coming back. He wanted to see the call in Tanner's phone log. So Tanner scrolled through his calls and he found it. The police noted that the call lasted 11 seconds.
Brace yourself for something fuel-nominal. Unleaded 88 is the clear fuel choice. It's cheaper, cleaner, and greener. And it's grown by Iowa corn farmers. Now that's totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88.
As this second interview continued, Tanner's story started to shift. Before, the last time he saw Faith was on October 27th when he dropped her off at work, but now it was Monday, October 28th. And the message he said he got about Faith being shot, well, he couldn't produce it and eventually admitted that he made it up. He said there was no message about her being shot. He also admitted that he and Faith had been physical several times in their relationship and that he thought she was getting ready to break up with him. In fact, that 11-second phone call that said she's gone and she's never coming back, Tanner said it was probably a breakup call. In spite of what he told the police, Tanner didn't think Faith was actually missing. She had left him voluntarily, and he was looking for her because he was, according to his own self-report, very controlling. The police then arrested Tanner Washington for false reporting of a crime and obstruction of an officer for saying that his girlfriend was missing and possibly shot when she had simply left him. But the problem was, Faith Lindsey was actually missing. This story Tanner told the police wasn't the truth any more than the first story was. It was on November 4th that Faith's family learned that she was missing, and that was because Tanner texted Faith's sister Justice to tell her that he didn't know where she was. And the reason Justice didn't realize Faith was missing before this was because she hadn't dropped out of touch. On October 29th, the same day Tanner was interviewed for the first time, people in Faith's life, including her sister and uncle, got Snapchat messages from her asking them to come pick her up, but the messages were vague. And in the days afterwards, they got even more messages. Now, everyone thought that these Snapchat messages coming through were a little weird because the spelling and grammar were bad. Faith was a 4.0, mostly straight-A student, and she could and did text without making mistakes like they saw in these messages. But everything was coming from her account, so they didn't really have any reason to believe these weren't coming from her. Maybe she made mistakes because she was in a stressful situation looking for a ride home. The messages continued even after Tanner called to say that Faith was missing and after Justice reported her missing. Justice even got a few phone calls from Faith's phone number, but the call would drop as soon as she answered. In one message she got, it was Faith basically saying that she was with someone who wouldn't bring her home. Early on, the family hoped that this meant that Faith was alive somewhere and needed to be rescued. In spite of Tanner backtracking his story about Faith being missing, the police continued to investigate even after they arrested him for a false report. And the investigation ramped up after Faith's family reported her missing for real. The police built out a timeline for both Faith and Tanner, mostly using phone records. The last time the investigators can confirm Faith was alive, as in someone other than Tanner saw her, was 9:43 p.m. on Sunday, October 27th, 2019. She was in Ada, Oklahoma with friends, and Tanner was not with her. However, the two were texting back and forth until about 10:30 that night. The messages told the police two things. One, they were planning on meeting up that night, and two, Tanner was not happy with Faith. It was the next day at 3:56 p.m. on October 28th that Tanner texted his ex-girlfriend, the one we're calling Kim, and instead of texting him back, Kim called him. According to her, Tanner told her on the phone that Faith was dead, and the two decided they were going to meet up later in the evening. When they did, Tanner said that Faith had been shot in the head, and he showed Kim a cell phone. He said it was Faith's phone, and that the blood on it was hers. Tanner said Faith had tried to fight for her life. That wasn't the only blood Kim saw, though. She said it looked like there was blood on his pants and his shoes as well. Tanner then asked Kim, if you kill someone, do you still go to heaven? Kim told him to take that question to her uncle, who was a pastor. And that's what he did, and that pastor's wife was the one who called the police. Kim wasn't the only one who told the police that she saw Faith's cell phone in Tanner's hand after Faith went missing, and during the time her family was getting messages from Faith. It was clear to the investigators that Tanner was using that phone, logged into Faith's account, in order to make her family believe she was still alive. And they further confirmed this when they saw the messages they knew were sent by Tanner. That bad spelling and grammar, that was all over Tanner's writing. The police then got a search warrant for Tanner's home and vehicle. On November 6th, they executed the warrant, and in Tanner's Camaro, they found blood on the passenger seat. It was on the surface of the seat as well as under it. They did not have Faith's DNA, so they took DNA from both of her parents and sent all of that to the lab. They also found a spent shell casing in the car. And then they learned that the Camaro was not the only vehicle Tanner had. They found out that Tanner had a Nissan Titan pickup truck. He had it in October, but at some point in late October or early November, he wasn't driving it anymore. Eventually, they learned that Tanner had stored the truck on someone's property in early November. But the property owner said that before Tanner and his mom showed up with the truck, there had not been any discussion about storing it there, so he did not know why they wanted to park it. The truck was on the property until November 16th when Tanner sold it. But here's the thing with that truck sale. The legal filing I have with this information only uses initials for everyone except Tanner Washington and Faith Lindsey. Siblings, parents, witnesses, they're all referred to by their initials, which is why I've had to use so many pseudonyms. In this document, the initials used for Tanner's mother are the same initials used for the person who bought the truck. So it looks like he may have sold the truck to his mother, but it is possible that there was a second person who had the same initials and they just didn't catch that when they wrote up the affidavit. Regardless, the truck was sold and it was moved to a second property on November 16th, and the police were able to search it with the permission of the owner on November 20th. And that's the thing with selling property. You might think you are getting rid of evidence, but what you're really doing is giving someone else control over it. And that control includes the right to consent to the police searching it. And as you can imagine, the investigators really wanted to look at that truck. Think about it. It's a truck that he used regularly and then stored somewhere other than his own home shortly after Faith went missing. And then he sold it and moved it as the investigation was heating up. The search revealed exactly why Tanner stopped driving that truck and started moving it around. They found significantly more blood in that truck than was in his car. On the back carpet of the truck, there were 2 stains that were about 6 by 12 inches in size. There was also blood on a pair of sunglasses, and all of this evidence, along with the blood from the Camaro, was sent to the lab. In December, those DNA tests came back. The blood, all of it from the car, the sunglasses, and that back carpet, belonged to a biological child of Faith's parents. At that point, on December 19th, 2019, Tanner was arrested and charged in Oklahoma State Court with Faith's murder. 3 months later, COVID all but shut down the courts, and Tanner's case came to a halt. And then, 7 months after Tanner's arrest, a Supreme Court decision came down in the case of McGirt v. Oklahoma. Now, I covered this with some depth in December of 2020 in an episode on Oklahoma MMIW cases, and then I touched on it again in the Brittany Tiger episode in August of 2021, so you can go back and listen to those if you want to, but it has been a while, and the law has been refined by the courts since then, so let's go ahead and get into it now. Believe it or not, the origin of this law started in 1823. I mean, it probably started with European contact, but 1823 is as far back as I'm willing to go right now. Up to that point, a lot of treaties were signed between tribes and the U.S. government, where the tribe would give their land over and then move to a different area. But in 1823, the Supreme Court ruled that Native tribes were not permitted to own land in the United States at all. If they wanted land, they would have to go past the western U.S. border. As we know, many tribes didn't want to go, so they didn't. 7 years later, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act to force them to move. The U.S. government then used a land they had in the eastern part of present-day Oklahoma to set up an Indian territory to give them somewhere to go. And thus began the Trail of Tears and other forced removals that we touched on earlier in this episode. By the 1890s, more than 60 tribes had moved to the Indian Territory. And while the Trail of Tears is what we learned about in school, it was just a snapshot of a larger, decades-long process. And the tribes weren't just driven from the east. Tribes in Kansas and Missouri, which sit just north of Oklahoma, were forced south. To this day, Missouri has no federally recognized tribes in the state because of it. So what happened to Indian Territory? The same thing that happened to every other promise made to the indigenous people of America. The government changed its mind and wanted the land, so they took it away. By the early 1900s, Indian Territory, or what was left of it, was parceled out to individuals rather than tribes. This was considered a necessary step for Oklahoma to gain statehood. All tribal governments had to be dissolved. Oklahoma was then admitted into the Union. A lot happened in the next 90 years, and policy on tribes in the United States and sovereignty was kind of a roller coaster depending on which way the government was trending. But we really can't get into all of that. We are just going to get to 1997, which was 90 years after Oklahoma became a state. In that year, Jim C. McGirt was convicted of sex crimes. Jim C. is an enrolled member of the Seminole Creek tribe, and the crimes happened in the part of Oklahoma that used to be Indian Territory. He ended up getting a life sentence in state prison. But as we have learned in previous cases, like the Ashland Mike case, any major violent crime that occurs on a reservation is the jurisdiction of the federal government, not the state. So Jimsey appealed based on this jurisdictional issue. He dusted off an 1833 treaty between the U.S. government and the Creek Nation that set a particular piece of land in present-day Oklahoma aside for the tribe. This treaty actually called this land, quote, a permanent home to the whole Creek Nation of Indians, end quote, and basically said they could stay there as long as they existed as a nation and continue to occupy the land. And guess what? The Muskogee Creek Nation has persisted, and they have continuously occupied that land. So the argument was that the treaty, though largely ignored for at least 100 years, still stood. And if that treaty still stood, that meant Jimsey committed his crimes on a reservation, and therefore the state had no right to try him for his crimes. In July of 2020, this appeal made its way up to the Supreme Court, who ruled in a 5-4 decision that Oklahoma did in fact lack the jurisdiction to try him. The majority opinion basically said that Congress never officially revoked this order, and if they wanted to dissolve the Creek Nation's rights to the land, they needed to do so through proper channels. They couldn't just claim squatters' rights. So shortly after this ruling, a meme started going around showing a new map of Oklahoma that cut off Indian territory. It was a bit of a joke, but a lot of people working in the legal system were not laughing, because they didn't know how broad this ruling was going to go. They had to start looking at past criminal charges of everyone living in Indian territory where the victim or the perpetrator was Native. They expected a flood of new appeals based on this. Several current cases would have to be dismissed in state court and then transferred to federal court. They would have to call families of victims and tell them that they might have to go through more court proceedings. It was just a very difficult way to right a historical wrong. Tanner Washington was one of the people who filed for his charges to be dismissed in state court based on the McGirt ruling, saying that Oklahoma had no jurisdiction over the crime since Faith was Chickasaw. And he was successful. Charges were dropped in May of 2021. But then the federal government took the case file the state had given them and immediately recharged him. So Tanner transferred from one court system to the other, but he was not let out due to this ruling. As for updates in the law, what happened in this case with Tanner Washington would not have happened as the law currently stands. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals handed down a ruling in early 2022 saying that McGirt was not retroactive. And then in Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta, it was decided in June of 2022 that the Supreme Court ruling on McGirt did not fully apply in cases where the defendant was not indigenous. In those cases where the victim was Native but the perpetrator was not, the federal government and the state courts had concurrent jurisdiction, so the case could have been tried in either. That applies here as Faith was Chickasaw, but Tanner was white. But those rulings that came down in 2022 were too late to apply to this case. In 2021, Tanner got his case moved to federal court, and then he was charged with first-degree murder in Indian country. And Tanner sat in pretrial lockup for another year before there was any significant movement on the case. On July 22, 2022, with all of this evidence against him, Tanner signed a plea deal. He would plead out to murder in the second degree in Indian country rather than first-degree murder. This saved Faith's family the pain of a trial, as well as hopefully saving them from an appeals process. While the charge was reduced through this plea deal, they did not agree to a sentence within the deal. Tanner could get as little as a few years in prison, or he could get a life sentence. But this did give Tanner a chance to get a lesser sentence and have a life after prison, which a conviction for first-degree murder would not have given him. The plea deal was made and accepted by the court on August 31st, 2022. And it was at that point that I decided to cover the case. I started researching for it a few months later and then decided to go ahead and wait on sentencing so that I could complete the episode. And then sentencing got postponed. And then it was postponed again and again. Tanner Washington was not sentenced until May 6th of 2024, nearly 2 years after making a plea deal and 4.5 years after Faith Lindsey went missing. The pre-sentencing report that is given to the court to give a guideline of what the sentence should be, taking in all aggravating and mitigating factors, is not public. It is a sealed document. But we do know, according to that report, it was suggested that Tanner serve 188 to 235 months, or about 15 to 20 years. This would mean Tanner Washington would be back on the streets by the time he was 45. The government did not agree with this, and they filed a motion for an upward departure, which would allow the court to give a harsher sentence. Should that not be granted, they were asking for an upward variance, meaning they wanted the very top of what the guidelines would be. Basically, they were trying for the stiffest sentence they could get. To get an upward departure, they would have to argue that there were aggravating factors to show that this crime was outside the, quote, heartland of homicide cases. One thing they pointed to was Faith's age. She was just 17. And the theft of her cell phone to send messages to her family to cover up her murder. Tanner then tried to hide evidence by selling his truck, and he has since refused to tell them where Faith's body was. That's right, even after pleading guilty, Tanner has refused to lead the police to where he left Faith. When the sentencing kept getting delayed, I thought it was because he was working with the authorities to recover her body. But according to the motion for the upward departure or variance, he wasn't. He was given several opportunities to do so. They contacted him in jail through his attorney for this information, and he refused to provide it. According to the government, this showed an ongoing cover-up of the extent of his crime, as well as not allowing Faith's family to lay her to rest. This was an act of cruelty and degradation, not just to Faith, but to her family as well. The government also noted Tanner's violent past. He was abusive not just to Faith, but to at least one other family member. Due to all of this evidence, the judge sided with the government and granted the upward departure. Tanner Washington was then sentenced to life in prison. The terms of the plea deal did not allow Tanner to appeal his guilty plea due to dissatisfaction with the sentence, but if the sentence did have the upward departure or variance, he was allowed to appeal it. And according to what I found in PACER, which is where you can see federal court records, he made his intent to do so immediately clear. One of the first steps in any appeal is to get a transcript of any proceedings, and according to PACER, that looks like it's the step they're currently in with this appeal, as Tanner has started serving his sentence in McCreary, which is a prison in Kentucky. In the meantime, Faith's sister hopes that telling Faith's story will be a warning to other young women in abusive relationships. A warning that it is not going to get better. Faith was only 17 and she didn't have the life experience to recognize the power imbalance in her relationship with Tanner, who was 7 years older. She didn't realize how much danger she was in with him. But if other people hear her story, they don't have to go through it themselves to get that life experience. They can listen to Faith's story, learn from it, and get out. I will leave links and phone numbers in the show notes for anyone who needs help, advice, or support in a domestic violence situation, whether you are 17 years old or 77 years old. Another reason we need to keep telling Faith's story is that she's still missing. This person will not say where she is, but that only means he won't tell the authorities. It doesn't mean he has never told anyone. We know Tanner was talking to people within 12 to 18 hours after Faith's murder, and he told people that she had been shot to death. He also made vague comments about it being, quote, because of him. He very well may have told someone where he left her body, or at least a broad area that could help narrow down the searches, and that someone needs to come forward. At the time she went missing, Faith was 17 years old. She was 5'2" and 120 pounds. She has a tattoo of a cross on her thumb and one on her abdomen of a key with her parents' initials, JL and SM. It's believed Faith's remains may be in Seminole, Garvin, or Pontotoc counties. This is that same central, south central area of Oklahoma we've been talking about. It has been nearly 5 years since Faith went missing. Her family deserves to lay her to rest. I don't care if Tanner was your best friend or your favorite relative. Think of Faith's family, who loved her just as much as you love Tanner. Think about being in their position and come forward. If you know anything, you can call the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation at 800-522-8017, or you can leave a tip with the FBI at tips.fbi.gov. As always, this information will be in the description. Do the right thing and bring Faith home. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.